Welcome to Joy Up with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I'm here with Julie Marzouk, a lawyer, activist, writer, former law school professor at Chapman University. Any other accolades here?
That sounds about right.
Amazing. And you've been doing a lot of work since October 7th for the Jewish community, so we're going to get to unpack all of it. Let's just jump right in, because we were talking a little bit last week, and you used to work also as an immigration lawyer and everything. And one of the things that I've been getting fired at my way from students and community members and everything is this Trump executive order to kick people out of the country who are here on student visas for protesting against Israel. So just to give like one story that I've seen on social media that I'm sure a lot of students have seen, and then you can give us all the background legalese, and then we can talk a little bit about it, is there was this one girl, I think at USC, that's sort of, going everywhere. She was a student from China that was here on a visa, and now everybody's saying how, her visa has been taken away. So let's start with the legal ramifications, and we'll talk a little bit about, philosophy for a second.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure. So I was an immigration lawyer, and then I taught the domestic violence immigration track of the Family Protection Clinic at Chapman University. And so my expertise was in representing victims of domestic violence and sexual assault in immigration petitions and asylum relief. And I have read that executive order closely, and I think there's a lot to unpack there.
This is why we brought you on, because you actually read the executive order, unlike everyone else who just sees the headlines.
Well, I think that's exactly right. So there is so much hysteria in the media, some of it well-deserved, some of it perhaps less so, and people aren't actually reading what is happening. They're just going on the stories that we see in the newspaper. And so the order itself actually doesn't change any policy. It gives the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, which touches on the issue that you brought up, and also Health and Human Services, 60 days to just explore remedies to fight anti-Semitism through legal means and report back. So this order doesn't change any law or policy. It actually just asks the various executive agencies to look into what they can do to fight anti-Semitism. And today, I actually, just before I went on the air with you, saw that today the president created a task force with each of those agencies to then review the findings and create proposals.
Got it. So it's a lot more bureaucratic than a lot of the headlines would have you think, whether these headlines are pro or against it. It's not like all of a sudden you're getting knocked on the door if you're a student and you were part of the encampments last year, hey, your visa's over.
Exactly right. And I did see those social media posts that you're referring to. So the headline I saw was that it was a UCLA student. And then I tried very hard to track down that story and find out whether it was legitimate. And I could not find any coverage of it other than on social media. So I'm not sure if that individual that we're both referring to actually did have her visa revoked. But certainly this executive order hasn't changed any laws at this point. But I am happy to talk about how student visas work.
Yeah, I think we can get into that a little bit. I think, it's funny because I sort of always have the two voices in my head. And for people that have been listening to my podcast for a while, they've heard guests on both sides. You have the, rah-rah Jews who are pro-Trump, that, Trump is going to be better for Israel. Trump is going to cure anti-Semitism here. And this is being sort of, spread by them as sort of this, look, Trump is doing this thing that Biden had, 2.5 years or 1.5 years to do and never did. On the other hand, from what you're saying is this is just a flashy headline with not much actually changing on the ground. Meaning if I'm a student and I'm on a student visa from China or Iran or, any one of these countries, I'm probably more afraid to be outwardly, pro-Hamas. But is anything actually changing for me in terms of my status?
So I think that perhaps the truth, like most things, lies someplace in between. I think there are large movements of change underfoot under the Trump administration. And some of the areas that the memo touches on really do have tools at their disposal that were not utilized under the Biden administration to combat anti-Semitism. So the biggest and most obvious is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which requires universities not to discriminate or allow Jewish students to be harassed or their safety threatened. And that tool was really underutilized in the Biden administration. And there were lots of lawsuits and settlements just before Biden went out the door. So I fully expect that to be used more robustly in the Trump administration. And that would fall under the Department of Justice. And then there is the Department of Education, there's Department of Homeland Security. So within the Department of Homeland Security, there is this idea that folks who are here on student visas have to prove, and the legal jargon is that they're not inadmissible. And one of the grounds of inadmissibility, so if you're applying for a student visa, you have to promise that you are not engaged in terrorism, supporting terrorism or extremism, or that you're going to work in any way counter to the government of the United States. And so you sign that when you get a visa. And then if at any point while you're here on a student visa, you are in conflict with those promises, your visa could be revoked. So that is already the Immigration and Nationality Act as it stands. But I think there is a question that this task force is going to gather about, which is what are the most effective ways to counter anti-Semitism? And I think the example of the individual student visa being revoked does pull on some issues about First Amendment that we want to protect, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. But then I think there's this other broader point that I expect the task force is going to look into, which is what is the most effective way? So if we're talking about biggest bang for our buck, I would really like to see the universities being held accountable, which are fostering these student groups, which then support the individual students. It seems like you can make a really big impact that way, and perhaps I don't know what the impact would be of deporting a particular individual student.
Yeah, it seems like past the flashy headlines, this does very little to actually help the problem. I think it also starts a dangerous precedent. I mean, it's interesting because conservatives tend to be the small government, be skeptical of the government. I don't necessarily want the government deciding who and what is, working in favor of them, against them. Obviously, there are clear-cut cases on both sides, right? If you're here and you're, meeting with terror cells, giving them information of, I don't know, where the police are stationed around campus. Okay, fine. That's an extreme example. But if you're just generally protesting in a movement that, the government tends to not like, I mean, it also depends who's in charge at any given time. It seems like that's a dangerous precedent to go down.
Well, I think there are actually less protections for non-citizens, including free speech protections, and there is legal precedent for that. But I think it does create a lot of concerning questions. We don't want to start a process where we're racially or religiously profiling students to then question them about their alleged ties to terrorism. At the same time, I think if there is quote, material support for terrorism, that, then that would potentially be a ground of inadmissibility. The part that I think actually is a bigger picture question that I think actually goes back to holding the universities accountable is that the First Amendment is not absolute. And there has never been a legal framework where you can say anything you want at any time. And that has been how free speech has been interpreted over the last 15 months, and in particular at the universities, and that any attempt by the universities to stop these protests or stop the harassment of individual Jewish students or professors would be contrary to the First Amendment. And the First Amendment has always had these exceptions. So incitement to violence is never protected under the First Amendment. Continued harassment of an individual is not protected under the First Amendment. Obscenity, which is, not relevant here, but there have always been these carve-outs. And so I think that there are ways that the Department of Justice and the Department of Education could get engaged to crack down on these protests without perhaps risking the individual free speech rights of a student.
Isn't there also, if you have a school, can't the school have its own rules that aren't necessarily subjected to the government? This is a topic I've tried to do a deep dive on. I'm confused. So you can help me unpack this. I'm sure your average listener is confused. Okay, so UC Irvine, it is a public school. So it's technically, under, the Constitution and all of the, guidelines of the First Amendment. But it's also a school that can have its own rules for if you want to be a student on campus, you have to follow these rules that aren't necessarily subjected to the federal or even state government. And so, because a lot of times last year, this was faced as a, free speech movement, right? If your campus is cracking down against the encampment, the campus is not allowing free speech. In another situation, right, just because you're not allowed to camp out in the middle of campus doesn't have anything to do with free speech, right? I'm allowed to have free speech and say whatever I want, I don't know, on the street outside here. If I put up a tent in the middle of the street and was blocking traffic, that's not a free speech issue. That's just, I don't know. I'm sure there's some other legalese for it. So
loitering. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So it just seemed like a lot of people got this wrong last year when they were trying to defend the encampment on the basis of free speech. This wasn't this wasn't necessarily the school saying you can't say this or you can't say that because of the First Amendment. It was either, hey, if we're going to be, build this little student community, here are things you shouldn't say, and if you say them, we're actually going to kick you out of the school. But there was never a case of them actually being arrested until they broke other laws, such as loitering and, breaking into buildings and everything.
Vandalism, etc. Right. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. So first, in terms of where the First Amendment applies. So UCI is a public school, receives state federal funding, so it would be subjected to the limitations of the First Amendment. But actually in California, the state legislature has passed through code protections that the First Amendment applies even in private schools. So in California, or schools like Stanford or USC are also obliged to follow the limitations of the First Amendment. But which is not the case in other private schools. Let's say, for example, Columbia, which has been in the news so much, or Cornell, or other private universities in other states. In California, all the schools are obligated to follow the First Amendment. But the First Amendment, as I said before, it has limitations, right? So incitement to violence, so blocking somebody's way is not a speech, right? That is just, I'm not sure if it would be loitering, if it would be, public disturbance. Of course, breaking into buildings or spray painting is vandalism. And then despite the First Amendment, all of these colleges and universities are allowed to have and do have student codes of conduct. And those codes of conduct can limit, like, for example, where people are protesting. So even within free speech, even within First Amendment protected spaces, schools can still put what we call time, place, and manner restrictions. So you can't favor one viewpoint. You can't make a law that's content-based, right? So I support Israel. I think that Israel has no right to exist, right? So you can't have a law or a regulation for the school that would be based on that. But you can certainly say to students, there's no sleeping in the middle of this lawn and you're disturbing. There's no blocking people from getting into their classroom. There's no harassing or circling them by a group of people so that they feel intimidated or scared. Those would be lawful limitations both under the First Amendment and under the codes of conduct that most of these schools have passed.
Yeah, and even more so, obviously, interrupting class. I mean, there was a situation in Columbia that I'm sure you saw that an Israel studies class was interrupted, obviously, at UC Irvine. We had our own situations, and that, of course, right, it's not a free speech issue. It's if you're interrupting, an academic class there.
Exactly. So that would fall under a time, place, and manner restriction, right? So obviously a code of conduct could say you can't interrupt class. But even if there wasn't that separate code of conduct, if the point of the class is to teach, let's say, math or physics, or even if it's to talk about world politics, there's a teacher who has a curriculum and a intended plan for the classroom, and for someone to come into the classroom and disrupt it and prevent the teaching would be a reasonable regulation of time, place, and manner. So that disturbance would be held invalid regardless of the subject matter. It's not because they're interrupting in protest of Israel, it's that they're interrupting the educational mission of the class.
Got it. So while I have you here, expert on immigration, I know we didn't plan to talk about this, but, obviously immigration was one of the biggest issues in the last election. Immigration is an issue that I'm personally torn on. I mean, I really see both sides well. In the anti-immigration, crowd, the coalition that got Trump elected, you kind of have these two different groups. You have sort of the economic populists, someone like Steve Bannon, who simply, America first. We want Americans to have all the good jobs, even if that means America can't compete as well on the world stage, right? That's sort of that view. The other view is sort of a national security one. It's where I would put someone more like, Vivek Ramaswamy, if he's still relevant, or even Elon Musk to some extent. And they kind of talk about how the Biden administration sort of let down all the guardrails of who actually comes into the country. It's one of these things I kind of feel similarly with trying to get news about, Israel-Palestine, where it's just so hard to even get a firm footing on what's true or not. I mean, if you listen to right-wing media, it just seems like there was, a relatively open border and there was no vetting who was coming in. And we had all these, Chinese nationals and Islamists, coming into the border that were going to mess up, cartels coming in. I'm just curious what you make of, not even the legal component of this, but this, wider debate about immigration that's happening right now, and just situating that within politics now.
Yeah. So I think it's really complicated, and I'm not sure that I know the true facts either. I think I have come to the point where I'm reading 6 different news sources every day to try to figure out what I think is true, because it is so complicated and so biased in all of the sources that we're reading. So in terms of who is able to come into the country, I think that our country depends on immigrant labor. And I think that in particular in the Republican Party, there is a sense that there's 2 camps, even within the Republican Party, right? So there's a group, I think this is what you alluded to, which is, that we need this labor and the expertise sometimes. So sometimes it's physical labor, sometimes it's construction or less glamorous, but sometimes it's, engineers in Silicon Valley. And then the other part being that we don't want, perhaps there is an antipathy towards immigrants, but there are not a lot of Americans rushing for the jobs that are being filled by that immigrant labor, nor are U.S. citizens interested in paying 5-6 times as much for their strawberries or blueberries. So I think it's popular to condemn immigrants and to say that there's an invasion, but I don't think the reality of what our country, even forget about philosophical, and I really support the idea of immigration as a grandchild of immigrants and a country built on immigration. I actually don't think that most people would like the actual result of what an immigrant-free country looks like. At the same time, do we need to have laws and regulations and security risks assessed? We absolutely do. I represented a lot of women in particular from the Muslim world in domestic violence and sexual assault cases. There are a lot of security background checks on people who are applying for asylum relief. So the idea that refugees that actually have refugee status when they come in are security risks, that really is overrated and not so much the case. Where people, I think, may have more of a valid point is where there are not appropriate checks for people who are coming from wherever else in the world up through Latin America and crossing the Mexican border, right? But the idea of really targeting refugees as a security risk, they're really some of the most vetted immigrants really in the entire system.
And when you differentiate that, what you just said, from the situation in Europe, where it seems clear from statistics that it actually is refugees that are making areas less safe.
So I actually don't think that's true in Europe. I think it's the children of refugees.
Okay.
So I think that there is no doubt that there are some populations that are coming to countries all over the world, in Europe and in the United States, who, for whatever reason, perhaps the blame lies on the society and the culture itself, or on the people who are arriving, but are not assimilating well. And then they have, or their educational opportunities or economic job opportunities feel limited. And what we see in terms of terrorism and extremism is really coming from the next generation. It's really not coming.
But if you were going to be, I mean, if I'm going to put on my right wing hat for a second, which I haven't worn in a couple weeks, I'm glad to put it on. Right, like what I would say is, who cares if it's the person or the person's kids, right? Like I look at a place like England or France or Amsterdam or Spain or Ireland, right? And I was just in Spain with my wife a couple months ago, like terrified to wear. Like the rabbi of the synagogue on Shabbat came up to me specially to make sure I don't wear a kippah. And this isn't because of, people that have been in Spain for a couple of generations. I mean, Spain had their sort of, white anti-Semitic moment 500 years ago, right, during the Inquisition. But now it was almost all, immigrants from Islamic countries. If I'm living in Barcelona or Paris or London, I don't care if it's the immigrant or the immigrant's kid. So, like, from an American perspective, right, just to complicate it a little bit, and I don't fully believe what I'm about to say, but just to throw it out there, because I know a lot of my listeners are, definitely more to the right than I am on this, so they would appreciate this, where they would say, the immigration of our grandparents was just different, right? Like our grandparents were coming in almost to assimilate and to, become a part of that American dream versus a lot of people now, right, that's kind of fizzled away. And, you do kind of have people, okay, some explicitly, right, in the case of, I think, a lot of Chinese nationals that are trying to come in. Also in the case of, some very specific targeted immigration from Islamic countries. But even in general, you just have this problem of, culture that, these are people that are not bringing in, again, generalization, but not bringing in a capital L liberal attitude of feminism and LGBTQ freedom and all of these things. And even, I'm curious if you're familiar with like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, is a Muslim woman, fled from Egypt, was a victim of female genital mutilation, and all of these things. And, she talks about it all the time and how, you have these enclaves in Europe where basically, you don't have, freedom of gender and, LGBTQ freedom, and it's not safe for Jews to be walking on the streets. Right. Like, so if somebody's voting and somebody wants to make the Jewish case for Trump, which, we've had on the podcast, I didn't vote for Trump. But you do have somebody saying like, listen, I'm about to have a kid. I don't want my kid to, grow up in a place like Paris or London. So like, okay, be a little bit more conservative with immigration. And like, okay, if that means I have to pay $1 more for strawberries, great. But as long as I know that my kid is generally going to be safe. I'm curious how you would respond just, philosophically to this,
Yeah, it's so complicated and so much in there. I think it's just trying to solve. So first of all, getting back to the security risk, I am really concerned with anti-Semitism on the right and the left, right? And so I think one of the big failures in our community is only to see the anti-Semitism of the party in which they happen to belong, right? So I am certainly concerned with white supremacy. I am extremely concerned with anti-Semitism coming from Islamist movements. I think that we as a society and European societies need to do a better job of integrating, right? So the biggest problem with anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism is really a marker of the failure of democracy. So when you have anti-Semitism, you have a decline in pluralism, a decline of freedoms of women's rights. You talked about LGBTQ rights. And so do I think that somehow we can't, as a society, educate immigrants and integrate them into our society? From all places, I think we can. I think we did in the past. I think there has been a real problem with the fracturization, if I made that word up correctly, of our society. And that is why we have homegrown anti-Semitism in addition to anti-Semitism that is being imported. I also do think there is some reality that there are immigrants who come to Europe and come to the United States from Muslim majority countries who import a prejudice and antipathy towards Jews that is taught to their children and that is extremely hard to dissipate when those are the values being taught at home. And I don't know that there is an easy solution, but then if you're saying that the responsibility doesn't fall on society to integrate these immigrants, then you're basically saying we're not going to take any immigrants from the Muslim world. And I think that that is really problematic as well. Then you're fueling hatred to the West within the Muslim world and just frothing extremism in those countries. So I don't think the answer is to say, if you are Muslim, you can't come to Europe or you can't come to the United States. And I think, if anything, the Jewish community needs to be doing a better job at reaching out to the Muslim community and building those allyships.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. I think, you have this paradox of, does a liberal worldview need to take into account illiberal worldviews, right? You have the same thing with pluralism, right? If we're both pluralists, do we need to make room for non-pluralistic views? I used to say yes, like emphatically yes. I'm not so sure anymore now that, I don't know if capital L liberals need to really take into account, like, I don't, to some extent, I think liberalism has this Overton window, and anyone to the right or anyone to the left of it, like, I kind of don't really care about mixing up their views into the things, obviously, to separate views from people in general. I'm curious just for other Trump executive orders, because I think we can get bogged down here all the time. I mean, the other big thing that people have been talking about is Trump sort of, gutting up all these, DEI-based initiatives in the government. I just had a whole debate about DEI in my last podcast, so we don't have to rehash all of that. But what do you know about this? What is going to be the trickle-down effects to the schools, big public schools in the country, are they going to not be allowed to spend money on these DEI systems? Or, I'm curious what you know about that.
I'm not sure I know. I don't think that anybody knows yet how this will unfold. I know that I support the idea of pluralism, but I know that DEI has been hijacked in a way that doesn't support pluralism. So when you're using DEI to pit people against each other, and it's the idea of multiculturalism versus there's a different word that I'm blanking on at the moment. Got it. Ethnic studies versus multiculturalism, right? So ethnic studies really is not based on the idea of let's celebrate everybody's differences. Let's honor all of our own traditions. Let's have separateness where we want it, but be part of one, as we were speaking, integrated community. If DEI means that, I really support that. If DEI means the world is separated between oppressors and oppressed, and that you are my enemy if you don't look like me or you can't understand what I'm going through, you're inherently part of the problem, then I don't think we're moving towards an integrated society that we need in order to foster our democracy and to further the opportunities, right? So when a society is hateful towards each other, not only do I think that it excludes, that it creates all this tension, it is also limiting the opportunities of the people who's intended to help, right? So if we have a society in which everybody is skeptical of each other, blaming each other, and excluding each other, I don't think that the first generation college student or the African American or Asian American or Latinos are benefiting in that paradigm either.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I mean, people want a lot more on DEI. They can go listen to the last podcast. I think we've, I've a little bit exhausted it. It is interesting just to throw out. It seems like everybody has a completely different definition to what DEI is. My knee-jerk response to that, reality of, you ask two people and you get four different opinions is that, okay, different companies can make whatever choice they have. It should not be mandated top down. So I still think it's ridiculous the fact that our California taxpayer dollars are going to fund DEI professionals at different campuses that are actually making things worse for Jews in the day-to-day. But, Well,
I think there is no doubt that DEI has, the Jews have not been included in DEI, and it has created a lot of anti-Semitism, and it has hijacked the social justice movement to somehow be anti-Semitic. And we know that Jews were always very involved in all aspects of social justice. I advocated largely on behalf of the Latino population for my 15 years in practice. And, Jews obviously were instrumental in the civil rights movement. I mean, the idea that Jews, as 0.2% of the world's population, are somehow privileged and therefore shouldn't be part of DEI. I mean, if that is just that is the core tenet of DEI, then yeah, it might need to be reworked.
What also the idiocy of this hierarchy of, the deserving, the have and the have-nots. I mean, it's almost a worldview that's built on needing people to fail because, you take Jews in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, we would have been the top of any hierarchical, or the top of any hierarchical list or the bottom, depending on, what your vantage point is. And then the last 70 years, both in America and Israel, because Jews succeeded, if that then flipped our spot onto the bottom, what you're basically signaling to all other minority communities is don't succeed because then you'll be screwed. It's just like the weird, same thing happened to Asian Americans, right? I was looking at statistics. So I'm pretty sure, Asian Americans, I think over 50% voted for Trump in the last election, which was the first time they got a Republican majority. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Asians went from being treated as this, oppressed minority that, get a lot of points. And then all of a sudden now that, affirmative action and all these things are disproportionately hurting, young Asian kids, it's flipped. And it just seems like such a dumb way to run. I mean, this is why, I said this with April Powers, but I sort of, the more I think about it, the more I realize it's true. We just need to institute colorblindness as our de facto political. I'm not talking about in our relationship. I obviously know that your gender is a female and mine's a male, so it doesn't help to pretend that that's not true. But when I'm making laws, it doesn't make sense to keep in mind, all of these different, external differences. And so it just seems so obvious that this sort of, ethnic and gender and identity centric way of governance is just, you're just going to constantly be pitting people against each other.
Yes. And I think perhaps those color focused rules and regulations, particularly like right after Reconstruction, after the Civil War and after the Civil Rights Movement, our society has changed. It has moved. The world is integrated. The world is different. So perhaps those rules or regulations made sense at the time. But now, I never would have thought of myself as a colorblind advocate. But there is no doubt that these rules and regulations are pitting people against each other, that they're dividing our society rather than moving people together. And, right, that, what's that expression? High tide rises all boats, right? So, we want, I want Asian Americans to succeed, and I believe they want the Jews to succeed, and I want African Americans to succeed. We should all be able to do so. And I certainly think that the ethos of America, what has made America exceptional, is this idea that you are judged on your merits. And I know that that is not true universally, right? This idea that, pull yourself up by your bootstraps is, it's a narrative that isn't really true for everybody, because there are people who had too many structural disadvantages for that to be the case. But by and large, that has what has made America unique, right? Because we're just a country of immigrants from all over places in the world. So there isn't actually anything exceptional about America other than this idea that if you work hard and that if you are of merit, that you can make something for yourself and your family. And that principle, really, we need to make sure that we don't lose them.
Yeah, and it also, this, obsessive focus on identity takes away from, I think, real systemic problems, which is class, right? I'll pull out, my left-wing hat for a second, right? Like, it's class difference that's the real difference in society now in 2025 between who has privilege and who doesn't. Skin color, gender, sexual orientation are almost nothing compared to, do you have money or do you not have money in America, right? Like, if you're poor, if you're making minimum wage and maybe you've inherited some medical debt, you basically are screwed in America. Our system is so broken right now that there's almost nothing you can do to build yourself out of it. If you have money, it doesn't matter if you're gay or you're black or you're Hispanic. You can basically do whatever you want. And I think, one of the, more sinister things of this identity-centric focus in the last couple of years is it actually allows companies and politicians to neatly evade this class question, right? So if you have these huge companies, let's take Google, that are constantly running these DEI programs and whatever, they don't actually have to deal with the true difficult problems, which is, class structure and difference in income and just these huge disparities that exist that I think, are much more important. And so, one of the things that our politics have done is, rather than fix, healthcare, which we should figure out a system to give every American healthcare, right, at some minimal level. But instead of doing that, people are now debating about, these like super crazy,
right,
stupid debates.
These small niches, and they are allowing to vilify and scapegoat groups, right? So, which is what anti-Semitism is all about. I need to tell the rabbi that. So, but I think, if you were trying to fix these harder structural problems, it actually takes a lot of work and group sacrifice for us to solve healthcare or to talk about what we want to do about educational inequity based on socioeconomic status. But yeah, it's a lot easier to point the finger and say, oh, it's all the Jews' fault, or it's all the transgenders' fault, or what.
No, but it's not, I think it's actually more sinister, right? I'll even up the ante a little bit. Having, what was that book, White Fragility or whatever, or Anti-Racist, all these ridiculous books that came out, right? You had a lot of upper middle class white people in the last couple of years that spent a lot of their social justice time, for those that are listening, I'm using air quotes, and it was literally spent like self-flagellating themselves of, I'm so bad for this, but they weren't actually doing anything, right? Maybe they were going on marches and tweeting, whatever the latest tweet was, Black Lives Matter, but like, the structural economic disparities in our country, like nobody was even touching that because everybody was, and so I think it was actually a very smart / sinister move from a lot of these companies to go all in on this racism stuff, because now the situation is, I have plenty of friends that are working at, all these fields in the tech sector, in the business sector, even in the academic sector. And, you know how it goes, right? Because there's this new DEI thing, you have to watch this 1 hour video that everybody sleeps through and is eating dinner and watching, football on one screen and is just clicking as fast as they can. And then the company's able to say, we did our, diversity training. And meanwhile, the company is still, not giving its workers healthcare, just some crazy thing that is so much more important. So I actually think, this is progressives' fault in some way for, when progressivism was about economics, I was there. But since it started going to this ethnic, it's almost like, Russian roulette with it, what's the next ethnicity to be blamed? Oh, okay. At some point I was talking to a past student of mine. He's actually now a lawyer in Los Angeles. He's a gay white man. And at some point I remember in undergrad, he said, Daniel, I'm not a minority anymore. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, I don't know. I went to some meeting in the LGBTQ club and said something. Yeah. And they were like, oh, you have no right to speak or something like that. You're just a gay man, which these days is straight. They were like some ridiculous thing. And I was like, this makes no sense. Like we've lost.
But I think that you've said a couple of times during this discussion, I'm going to put on my left wing hat or my right wing hat. And I think some of the things that I've said, perhaps right-wing people would find offensive, and other things left-wing people, right? So I think the problem is also that why do we need to fit into these limited camps, right? And why can't we have a more nuanced discussion that perhaps looks at the fact that we haven't gotten it right on either side, and that there are real problems to be solved, and if we want to fix them, we need to think outside of our little bubbles.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I know something else you've been really involved in is City Hall locally here in Orange County. I obviously talked to Tammy Kim, almost a year ago, I think. And I've been somewhat involved in the, at least hearings about what has happened. I've been mostly campus centric, but I mean, what is important, do you think,
Thank you so much for bringing it up. It has been a huge part of my advocacy in the last year. There was really almost an entire year of really hateful anti-Semitic comments in Irvine City Hall that were given carte blanche at the speaker's podium during public comment. And there were really even hateful things that were echoed from the mayor and city council members on the dais. And so I really tried to take this from a legal perspective, which is that, getting back to that First Amendment discussion, City Hall is what we call a limited public forum. So in addition to the fact that you can put time, place, and manner restrictions on even full or open public forums, city councils are business meetings for the functioning of the city of Irvine. The city of Santa Ana had very similar vile rhetoric. The city in Anaheim, this is not an Irvine problem. This is across the country.
Can you give an example for people that don't know what you're talking about?
Absolutely. So public comments were given every 2 weeks for literally about a 10-month period that were allegedly under the auspices of advocating for a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war. But the rhetoric went like this. Everybody here who's opposed to the ceasefire is a baby killer. You're all genocide lovers. You are pedophiles who go to Israel to escape justice. I mean, just, Israelis drop white phosphorus on children. So, some of it directed at Israel, some of it directed at Jews, some of it directed at as Jews under the name of Zionists. But it had nothing to do with the jurisdiction of Irvine or Santa Ana or Anaheim City Hall, nor did most of the hateful rhetoric have anything to do with the war in the Middle East. So I was trying to, again, say to the city council members and the mayor that in addition to the fact that they can limit public comment, there are rules within the code that specifically prevent hate speech, harassment, threatening language, loud and disruptive, defamation. So if someone wants to go up to the speaker's podium and say, all Jews are baby killers, even if they're allegedly speaking on something that was within the jurisdiction of the city of Irvine, that is hateful, defamatory rhetoric that shouldn't be allowed, and given the seal of the city of Irvine behind it. And, these comments are put out on closed circuit television, ICTV, and they're recorded and available on the city website. So this is given the stamp of approval from the city. These are there's no other group, no other minority for which this hateful kind of attack would have been tolerated. If somebody went up to the city council and made racial slurs against Black people, in fact, we had an example in Irvine City Hall where someone came and made this anti-Asian comment to Tammy Kim. And at the time, the council backed her up and said, we're not going to have that hate in here. That's uncalled for, and you're not going to call council members names.
How is that not to, I agree with you, this is anti-Semitic and everything like that, but I guess, how is that against the First Amendment? Meaning, if I genuinely think that Jews are baby killers, which I don't, for the record, why shouldn't I be, just to play devil's advocate, why shouldn't I be allowed to show up to a city? Like, why should anybody on the city council be able to say, no, actually, we're not allowed to hear this opinion? As long as I'm not saying, and there's a Jew, let's go get them. Like, shouldn't that fit under free speech?
Well, because the city council isn't a public park. It is not an open forum for people to spout out any hateful thing that they want. The city council, even the mayor, when they read the instructions before people come up to comment, quote the statute of the Irvine Municipal Code and say anything that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city of Irvine can be commented on, but if it's not on the agenda, we can't act upon it. So going up and saying, Jews are pedophiles and Jews just want to murder everybody in Gaza, none of that, there is no jurisdiction. The city of Irvine has no authority over whether the war ends or not, let alone to try to figure out whether Jews are really baby killers, right? This is not what they were elected to do. Nobody asked them their Middle East politics when they voted for them, and they don't have any authority to make a decision on this. So it is not a therapy session, nor is it a public park where you can scream and shout whatever you want.
Interesting. Okay, I guess that makes sense. Is that still happening right now?
It is to some extent. So there were huge mobs of people who were coming in mass with their keffiyehs. Some of them had full what looked like Halloween costume masks on. There were people that had fake dead babies swinging them in our faces. So there was a moment in which the council was packed and was going on for hours with this hate. It has certainly subsided, but we don't think it's over. We think that there are we know that a lot of these people were organized, if not probably paid, and that we have seen. So the first round of this activism was to use municipalities to advocate for ceasefires. And we've seen, or at least right now, there's a ceasefire in the Middle East. But the second round of that activism is really to advocate for BDS, to advocate for the city to divest their pension funds from anything related to Israel. And so we are anticipating that this mob of hate will return to the various city councils. And some cities in California have actually passed those divestment measures. So Vallejo and Richmond actually passed. So those are both in Northern California.
And what does that mean practically? It means that if they need some new sprinkler system, that they're not purchasing it from an Israeli company, from the economics.
So it actually means something more sinister for the public workers. What it means is that they're asking the various cities to pull companies out of the pension plans of the city workers if they have any association, and not make the pension plan investments based on what is the best investment or what's going to make the city employees the best retirement savings, but whether or not they allegedly have a connection to Israel.
I see. Because I remember a couple years ago when the UCs tried doing this. I remember doing a deep dive when I was a student. This is now 10 years ago. And, you just look in the S&P 500 and which companies work with Israel, and it's almost all of them. I mean, so I remember trying to actually figure out, okay, what would UCLA, where I went as an undergrad, do with their, whatever hundreds of $1 million in terms of their endowment. And the whole thing was almost comical. It's of course they're not going to do this. Maybe for a small town city, you can get away with that without anybody realizing this. But it just seems,
It is, the world is completely integrated. I mean, when all these people are yelling at me to divest, and then they're using their cell phone with Israeli technology in it, I'm like, it is farcical, right? And all of these companies, so Caterpillars, Starbucks are always on the list, like they have.
I'm actually upset. I was, there was a 2-month period. I'm at Starbucks at UC Irvine all the time. Last November, the lines were empty and it was great. And now when I go to class, it's packed again and I'm upset. And I almost, I keep joking around with students. We got to, get people to boycott the Starbucks on campus because the lines are too long. But,
I mean, we're laughing about it and we're making a joke about it. But the reality is what it is trying to delegitimize Israel. And also, of course, it's national origin discrimination, right? So if you're divesting from a specific company or saying that you're not going to have a relationship, it's only based on that national origin, which is really, contrary to all the civil rights laws in the United States. Is it actually possible, or would it make would it actually hit the Israeli economy? Probably not, because the world is so integrated. But I mean, I really think Israel, it's a PR war, right? And these mobs in City Hall were not there to try to actually change Middle East policy. They knew as well as I did that the city council wasn't going to decide whether or not there was a ceasefire, but they were indoctrinating the community into this hateful rhetoric, and it spilled out of City Hall. So it wasn't just the people who were there. They brought children, or people went back and told their kids, and then kids in Irvine schools are repeating the same hateful rhetoric on the playground. So, I think it is laughable that you could actually do this, but it's also a very serious and not appropriate use of all of our public dollars and time. And remember that city councils are paid for by our tax dollars, as are the council members' salaries. So this isn't something that we should be paying for.
Yeah. I'm in the middle of my 13th year living on a college campus and teaching and working and being a student. So I almost have to make fun of these things because the number of student government meetings I've sat through over the last 13 years where they've talked about their grand plans to end any scientific partnerships between Israeli universities and America, and at some point you just have to laugh at it, and so excuse the crude humor that I'm using here. I'm debating if I want to stay on City Hall or go a little bit wider. I guess we can go a little bit wider because I know you're involved in a lot of cool projects, so we can just hit them off one by one. You've done a lot of work surrounding CARE, which, a couple of years ago, I remember it was very controversial to talk about. I remember, listening to, I forgot, one of these right-wing pundits who was, going on and on about how CARE is connected to terrorist groups. And that was basically a position that was only fashionable and not even mainstream right, but, relatively, far to the right. It seems like now that view is becoming a lot more mainstream, and I know you've been doing a lot of work on that. So for someone that doesn't know what CARE is, can you just talk about it? What does it stand for? What's it connected to? And what is this debate and why is it important?
So I don't think it is widespread. I think CARE, unfortunately, continues to have far too much legitimacy, particularly in California and at the state legislature. But going back as to what CARE is, so the Council of American Islamic Relations, it purports to be a civil rights organization that advocates for the well-being of Muslim Americans. I couldn't agree with that concept anymore. I certainly want everyone in America to have their civil rights honored. But CARE has supported Hamas for 30 years. And the founder, who is now the national executive director, is on record saying, I support the Hamas movement 30 years ago. Post October 7th, almost all of their leadership has come out and celebrated the October 7th attacks. So just a day or two after the October 7th attacks, the national director said that he expressed his happiness at seeing the Palestinians break the siege. The San Francisco director of CARE called the leader of Hezbollah when he was killed, Nasrallah, that he was a martyr and a hero. The Los Angeles County executive director of CARE has said that Israel, as an occupier, has no right to defend itself. So it is not an organization. I mean, its rhetoric is plainly supportive of Hamas and Hezbollah and does not recognize Israel's rights to exist and isn't really focused on the well-being and civil rights of Muslim Americans, but rather hyper-focused on ceasing Israel's right to exist.
Got it. This is almost, because oftentimes CARE is sort of called the, ADL for the Islamic community, the Anti-Defamation League. The parallel in my mind is if the ADL spent almost all of its time defending the most radical settlers that go and burn down Palestinian villages. I mean, it would almost be synonymous there. I also will flag that, at least one Muslim country, the UAE, also views CARE as an official terrorist group. It's on their list. It's not an official. Is it an official terrorist group in the U.S.?
Not only is it not an official terrorist group, it is recognized and legitimized as a civil rights organization, despite all of these on the record comments. So the state of California gave CARE just in the last 2 years $5 million under the California Department of Social Services Stop the Hate program. So not only is it not delegitimized, but our tax dollars are going to this organization to fight hate, an organization that glorifies Hamas and Hezbollah and either relishes in the civilian atrocities of October 7th or denies their existence. So they were CARE was recognized as part of the Biden White House anti-Semitism group, fighting anti-Semitism. After October 7th and those comments were made, then they were basically kicked out of the task force, but they are still regarded as the equivalent of the ADL. But the ADL does not go around and say that Muslims or any other religious group should be persecuted or killed or raped or tortured. And when in fact there is persecution of other religious groups, the ADL stands up to fight for religious freedom and protection of all races and all religion. That is most certainly not the case when it comes to CARE.
So you would pin this mostly on the current California. I mean, is this Gavin Newsom? I mean, who is this?
No, it's nationwide. So this is a problem with CARE nationwide. The leaders of CARE really come out of the Holy Land Foundation, which was a charity that was shut down after, I think, a 5 or 7 year investigation and trial that showed their links to Hamas. CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator in that trial. And the people who then left the Holy Land Foundation just moved over to CARE and brought their beliefs. There is an attempt to try to see the funding, to see whether there is direct financial support, either to Hamas or receiving funds from Hamas. But CARE has been asked to open up its books repeatedly and has refused to do so. There's right now a civil litigation in which maybe they're going to be forced to open their books. This is a bit of righteous justice. Yeah. I don't know if you know this story.
No.
Okay, so there was this woman who worked for CARE who alleged sexual assault or sexual harassment, and she's not the only employee to have done so. And when she alleged that, CARE sued her for defamation. And
it seems to be a common theme with the Hamas supporters is, we'll get, not...
Yes.
Not acknowledging sexual.
Exactly. We're going to shut you up in some other way. So then she countersued. The suit against her was dropped. And she then countersued for defamation. And that case is still ongoing. And as part of that countersuit, they may in fact have to open up their financial records. But CARE is not the only group that shouldn't be receiving. So my two issues with CARE are, one, they shouldn't be receiving tax exempt status, right? So if they are associated or glorifying or supporting terrorism, they shouldn't then get tax benefits from the U.S. federal government. Nor do I think they should be getting actual direct grants from the state of California or the federal government. And I'm sure there are many other states in which they receive grant funding from state legislatures as well. I've just been working more closely in California.
Got it. And are elected officials, open to this? I mean, probably mostly behind closed doors, I'm assuming you're not doing podcasts with, whatever elected officials. But, one of the reasons why I am no longer a progressive, and even, to some extent, I'm growing increasingly uncomfortable with, being a Democrat, I really like people like Sam Harris or Bill Maher. I don't know if you're, familiar with them. And, they're liberals, right? Capital L liberals. And they talk about how it seems like the left is sort of blind to Islamism, right? Again, not all Muslims, of course, but this Islamist ideology that is, indicative of groups like CARE, obviously Hamas, obviously a lot of, the people that are supporting, Hamas and Hezbollah and, the Iranian regime, was another one, and Assad in Syria. And it just seems, I don't know what to, it's, what's the famous quote, never ascribe to animosity that which you can describe to idiocy. So, at this point, I just think that most progressives are just stupid. I mean, I hate to say it any other way. It seems like they think that evil can only come from the right, and it's only white people that have ever done bad things. And, I just don't really get it.
Well, it's really just, I wish we had more. There are many Muslims who do not agree with fundamentalism that are not Islamists.
No, they're the most hurt. Sorry to cut you off. It's Muslims that are actually the most hurt by Islamism.
Yeah.
I mean,
But I wish we had more advocates. It is hard. And I wish we had more of those voices coming forward. But I think the reason why liberals are afraid to call out care, so your question was about when I meet with state legislatures, are they open to this? Yes, but it's really hard because they know they're going to be immediately accused of Islamophobia. And I'm sure that if anybody watches this podcast, they'll accuse me of Islamophobia.
No, I hope you don't want to keep teaching at Chapman. I'm kidding. No, I mean, but it is just one of those things that's almost, one of the ways in which I think the post-October 7th world sort of ruined progressivism in general is now, I don't really care what people call me anymore. I mean, when I'm on campus for a year and you're called, as you said before, if someone calls me a babysitter, baby killer, genocidal maniac, white supremacist Nazi, if someone also alleges that I'm sexist, it's like, oh, okay, that's, it's like, who cares at that point?
Right.
Not to say you shouldn't, try to not be sexist or racist, but it's almost like, I think anybody that wants to be honest, can listen to somebody's views and hear out, okay, here are principled defenses for this, and they can either agree or not agree, but to actually allege, an ad hominem of that says something about your person. I mean, to a large extent, I think a lot of people have sort of stopped caring. I mean, you even saw it with, Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know if you saw this, they officially changed Facebook back to, having no censored. And he was just on a long podcast, I'm forgetting which one, talking all about, how, he's done with this whole, political correct, I forgot what, wokeness or whatever it's called. And it just seems to be, really tipping the other way. And, I'm around college students all day. And so, I really hear it with them. I mean, the things that college students are talking about now in the open and joking about are not the same things that college students 4 years ago. And now it's sort of a lot more open, and people, it seems like that, cloud of, where everything was moving to the left and you sort of had to affirm, all of the things, Black Lives Matter and, all these different, it just kind of seems like that's ending. And I think October 7th actually had a lot to snap people out of the spell, because it's just sort of obvious that when you look at, different groups, okay, there's some good and some bad and everything. And so I don't know.
I hope that that's true, because, when I watch the college protests and I see these girls in their crop tops and mini shorts, like standing up for Hamas, I'm like, what are you doing? Like, these women, we all know that they would be assaulted or probably killed for, showing their skin, that this is a regressive regime that does not support women, that does not support LGBT rights. I mean, the Queers for Palestine, like, it just kills me, but I don't know if people have awoken to that or not.
Well, a lot of the levers of, I guess what I mean by that is I'm not saying every single person, but the levers of culture are certainly shifting in terms of what are the big companies doing. Obviously, the government is sort of the big one, but where are the big companies moving? So whereas a couple years ago, 5 years ago, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg was going on podcasts talking about, Black Lives Matter and DEI and why Facebook supports all this and why, of course, the vaccine came from, the market instead of a lab, which was the stupidest debate of probably the 21st century of not being political. And then, now 5 years later, he goes on, is basically like, back to free speech. Everyone should say what they want, and sort of, the old school liberal of like, okay, the best ideas will sort of go to the top. And so I think it'll take a couple of years for that to necessarily get to campus. I think there's also a gendered aspect to this. I talked about this a lot in my post-election podcast, where young men are much more to the right than young women. And I think, there's a whole set of reasons for that and diagnoses. But yeah, I mean, I guess
I just really hope that people can hear those, because, you're never going to convince an extremist, right? So, for example, when I was in City Hall, I wasn't trying to convince the people calling me a baby killer. I was trying to convince the city council members who I hope to be rational, reasonable human beings. But I hope that there is an ability for people to talk to each other and to have those conversations, because I think, people are just in their camp. So if we go back to the beginning of our conversation in that Trump executive order, nobody is looking at the executive order on anti-Semitism, in the liberal camp and saying, hey, maybe this is a really good thing. And we're not we want lawful ways to fight anti-Semitism. They've only zeroed in on this one line in the memo, taken it out of context and say, oh, now they're going to go after all immigrants and this is a shutdown of free speech. So, I don't know. We just have a heart, yes, the federal government is moving. Yes, corporations are moving. I don't know how many hearts and minds are moving.
No, people seem to be really bad at just taking ideas in isolation. It's funny because I grew up, I don't know how much I told you about my background. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community where basically everybody believed the same thing about religion and politics, but it was actually a more open place of discourse than I think a lot of more progressive areas where we were learning Talmud for hours a day and you were supposed to find problems with the other side's argument and debate about what these stories in the Torah mean. And, the different medieval commentators all disagree. And so for me, engaging in any type of thoughtful exercise in middle school, high school, or when I was in yeshiva in Israel was, okay, how do we isolate an argument? How do we evaluate it? To say nothing, if you rejected Rashi, the medieval French sages reading of a story in the Torah and you preferred Nachmanides, the 13th century, Spanish thinker, you weren't saying you think Rashi's an immoral idiot. You were just like, oh, his reading makes a little bit of sense here. And, it's funny that doesn't exist now. I see some people that back when Biden was president, every single thing they posted was Biden is evil, he's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And now I see it, Trump was evil, he's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And, neither of these sides can really give you a great analysis of what exactly is good, what exactly is bad.
Right. And the truth is, the more you know, the more the world is gray. And it's not neither of these extremes. But, I think my experience is very similar to what you just shared, which is that, when I lived in these, quote, liberal bubbles in San Francisco and in Berkeley, and everybody thinks they're so open-minded, they're absolutely not open-minded. They are dogmatic. It has to be this way, otherwise you're a horrible person. Then I moved to Orange County, which is truly the most diverse place I've ever lived. Economically, maybe not in Irvine, but if you get out into the larger Orange County, politically, religiously, and because I am living with people who have different political beliefs and are coming from a different place, I'm learning, I'm listening, and I'm open to seeing things that I wasn't able to see when I was only surrounded by people that thought exactly like me.
Yeah, so that's a lot of people's question. I'm just curious to get your thoughts. There's been a lot of people talking about the end of the golden age for American Jewry in the last couple of years. I'm curious where you situate yourself on that. Are Jews in America, sort of our golden age coming to an end? Should we all be looking to move to Israel? Is this just a temporary blip that things are going to immediately get better? Where do you, what's your knee-jerk response?
I don't know. I think that the world has fundamentally shifted. I feel a shift. I don't think we should all be running to Israel because I think we need to have strong American Jewish presence to continue to support Israel from abroad, in addition to the fact that I'm a proud American. But
I don't think we'd be saying that if we lived in France, meaning I would explicitly, it's funny because a couple of years ago, what was it, maybe 2009 even, I don't know, listeners should definitely fact check me here, where there was a terrorist attack in a supermarket in France and Bibi Netanyahu, who I'm definitely no fan of, tweeted out, Israel is your home, you should come home. And I was actually offended for French Jews at that point. I remember reading that. I don't remember, I'm forgetting what year this was.
No, I remember it too.
But I remember I was offended because I was like, well, Bibi Netanyahu should not be telling these Jews in France to leave. Jews have a long history in France and it's great. And now I hate Bibi's politics, but now I kind of retroactively agree with them. Jews shouldn't be living in France. I think.
Right, but I've also heard some French politicians say if France loses their Jews, it's no longer France, right?
Well, you can't pretend. Then I guess it ceased to be France a couple times in the medieval period, then that means. But no, I guess I just, Jews can't, this is sort of, this was Herzl's point, 130 years ago, which the more you read Herzl, the more you realize how correct he was. Where, okay, so these countries need to prove themselves before Jews give it a chance, as opposed to, wait around to see if it'll, give it a chance. And so I think in some sense, what's been happening in Europe, I mean, Jews have never really been safe in these big European cities. Maybe there was a couple years where they felt bad about the Holocaust, so they were hyper vigilant in places like Paris or London to not treat Jews badly. But I don't know. I mean, I definitely, I mean, again, it's easy to say this now, having grown up in America. I don't have my, school and job and kids living in a different country, but
I mean, I never thought that I didn't realize that the level of anti-Semitism was so just beneath the surface that it could explode so widely, so rapidly in the United States. I experienced anti-Semitism as a kid in public schools. There were kids who drew Nazi, whatever, swastikas on binders and called me whatever, dirty Jew. But I mean, I never thought my opportunities really were limited. I always had a very sense of my strong Jewish identity, but I really fundamentally did not think that the world, that America had an issue with me as a Jew. I definitely think the world and America have an issue with me as a Jew right now.
So then, in some sense, what I hear a lot of Israelis saying is, okay, then just move to Israel. I still am not ready to do that. I don't know why, because I'm a student of Jewish history, but I do think America in the long run is actually going to be great. I do not think this is the end of the Jewish golden age. I don't think I've ever shared that opinion on the podcast before, but I know a lot of people do have strong feelings about that. So I was curious to run that by you.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think it's something. I talk to my relatives of my mom's generation, and they can't see it. Right. They think, no, this is fine here. And it reminds me so much of the sentiments that we heard of people in Europe who were like, I'm German and this is never going to go really bad for the Jews here. And, I was just with my uncle yesterday, and I feel like there were some similar sentiments. And so that's the generation above me. And then the generation below me, my children also don't see it. Right now, they go to a Jewish day school and live their lives very surrounded by Jews, but they too think that I'm overreacting and hypervigilant. So I don't know. I hope the generation above me and below me is more accurate, but I do think that it's a turning point. I don't know that it's a broken point, but I think something has changed. And I think the most important thing is for Jews to stand up and advocate for themselves. And I think so long in so many societies, we've just been taught to keep our head down, mind our own business, take care of our families, and, don't make trouble. And so I'm trying to make some good trouble, because I think that's what we need.
No, I really appreciate that. Okay, we've been talking for a while. I think we can go on forever about this. What else have we not talked about that you think is important? I jotted down some notes. I think we got through all the notes that I jotted down with my marker before we started here. But.
Okay, well, let's see. The last op-ed I wrote was on the Red Cross's disastrous failure in the hostage exchange and in representing the hostages over the last 15 months in general. And I guess that my advocacy on behalf of the Jewish community, and then my years of advocacy on behalf of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, really come together here, which is that I feel like the re-victimization, of the men as well, but of particularly of these women by these, horrific staged performances by Hamas, really shows how ineffective and how biased, not neutral, the Red Cross has been throughout this process.
You probably have a lot more progressive friends than I do. Just based on, I'm just I'm stereotyping. I've only known you for a couple months, but you were an immigration lawyer working for women battered by sexual assault. So that seems like you also, that would go with like a NPR. NPR mug. So I'm not saying that in jest. I'm only saying that because of my background, most of my friends are actually to the right of me. Yeah. So I usually find myself as like the liberal or progressive devil's advocate. But I'm curious. When a couple of years ago during Me Too, when progressives were saying "believe all women," which I always thought was foolish anyway. Mm-hmm. And now it's, high rapes that Hamas broadcasted on, live stream are being denied. Are people even, it's hard for me to get into the mentality of, I'm not talking about an Islamist apologist who's just trying to confuse people, but like a genuine progressive who thinks they're doing what's right for women in the world. Like there was even actually a talk at Berkeley. I was talking with a UCI grad student about this because we were, sending each other pictures of this. A talk at Berkeley by either a grad student or a visiting assistant professor. Somebody could look this up. And I just saw the name of it. And it said, how Israel takes advantage of progressive ideas such as believe all women in their eradication of Palestinians. And I'm like, so basically what you're saying is like, if Israelis claim sexual assault, you should,
it's inexcusable. So I actually saw yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was an op-ed on that lecture by a Berkeley law professor.
Okay, I didn't actually see that. I only saw the blurb posted on,
Yes. It's inexcusable. I mean, the UN silence on the women, human rights orgs, where's Amnesty International? Where is now the National Organization for Women, or let's just talk about progressive women's spaces in terms of abortion rights advocates. Where are these women's rights voices saying that sexual assault is unacceptable, that women should never be used as tools of war, that we have the Geneva Convention and the UN Declaration of Human Rights to specifically remove rape as a tool of war, and yet we saw with our own eyes, and there is radio silence from all of the left, but in particularly from women's rights orgs. And it's to say that believe all women except for Israeli women, that women's bodies matter unless you're Jewish. Yeah. It is really, it's reprehensible. And I think it also, in terms of why has the left been silent on it, it just doesn't fit into the narrative, right? So it's hard to hold two truths simultaneously in your hands. If the Palestinians are all good and the Israelis are all bad, it's pretty hard to then process, well, I thought rape was bad, but maybe this is resistance. Well, it's not resistance, right? And so these were, civilians, and obviously there were the IDF observers that were also taken hostage. But yeah, we have to have some basic, limited, shared beliefs that women shouldn't be raped and tortured as an element of war.
Yeah, and then to your point about the Red Cross, obviously the Red Cross did not go visit the hostages. And there was actually at UCI last week, there was a panel by a couple of doctors, or one doctor in particular, who went to Gaza to go, do some healthcare there. And, I think somebody asked her, had she visited the hostages? And the question was almost laughed away. I mean, it's just this glaring, contradiction.
One of the hostages said that they were in a van under a Red Cross facility for like 12 hours at a transfer point.
Yeah. So when Trump says that he wants to defund all these things, I mean, I see a lot of people that I know that are quite progressive freaking out about this. I don't really know what I think about this yet. I haven't looked into it enough, but I was actually going to read about it later. But I mean, what do you think? Because there is an argument for kind of tearing it all down, and even okay, the debate I think is more clear cut with UNRWA, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sure UNRWA does some good work, for other people who really need it. On the other hand, I don't want my tax money going to
Well, I think UNRWA just has, I don't have any qualms about defunding UNRWA. It has shown itself entirely complicit with Hamas, if not an active participant in October 7th, and holding and hiding the hostages and all of the other elements. In terms of a blanket shutdown all of USAID, I think maybe you need to, I don't know what that expression is, but, hammer with a nail instead of a sledgehammer. I don't know, missing the analogy. But, maybe it needs to be fixed, but maybe it needs to be evaluated and fixed in parts where it is broken. I would agree that UNRWA is broken. I don't know that simultaneously wanting to deport all people seeking asylum from the Central America and then defunding, projects to make Central America a safer place to live makes sense, right? If you want to stop people from coming north, then you need to give federal aid to make, shut down the influence of gangs and make it safer and easier to live in the Northern Triangle. So I don't know that you can just blanket defund all foreign aid in a responsible way. But certainly I think the Red Cross and UNRWA, and putting back on my immigration hat, immigration law worldwide, so the International Refugee Convention says that if you resettle in a third country, that you no longer eligible for refugee status, and nobody intergenerationally is eligible for refugee status. So, for example, my husband's family is from Egypt. His parents came here, they became U.S. citizens. He was born here. So, obviously he's a U.S. citizen, but he is by no stretch in any international treaty a refugee. And yet that is the status that UNRWA is holding, right, for the Palestinian people. So if somebody's grandparents was born in what is now Israel, then they're considered a refugee that has, allegedly a right to return. In no other refugee status and no other population in the world is that the case.
Yeah, no, I've talked, for hours on end here about how the Palestinians are basically been used as pawns by anti-Semites to try to destroy Israel for, 80 years. I mean, I feel bad for the Palestinians because it's so obvious that they're just not able to have any sense of normalcy. I mean, again, they were refugees in the 40s, even if we think the Nakba was as bad as they say it was, which it's much more complicated if you read, historians that do, real history on the subject. But even if the Nakba was this catastrophe and 700,000 people were kicked out in the 1940s, I mean, a lot of people were made refugees by various wars. And,
well, that's what I'm saying. My mother-in-law was a refugee from Egypt in 1967. That doesn't make my husband or even yet my children refugees in the United States.
Well, just think about how unhealthy it would be if my grandparent, from the moment I was born, told me I was a Russian refugee. My grandfather was born in Minsk and fled the Nazis when he was like 7 and lived in a, forest for a couple of years with his parents. And so, he was certainly a refugee to America. And so, with my dad and me, from the moment I was born, we hate, Russia and, because the Nazi, or Germany, whoever you want to place the blame of. And, the whole point of your life, it's like, let somebody, live a normal life, somewhere else. There's a lot of, Palestinians living in America or Europe that should just, acclimate to these countries. Doesn't mean they can't have a connection to their homeland. One of the big things that has recently resurfaced. I don't know what I think of this also yet. A lot of, things I'm not certain about yet. Bibi Netanyahu and Trump are meeting right now, maybe as we're talking. We're talking on Monday, just for listeners that might be listening to this on a Wednesday or Thursday or something. And one of the proposals, I mean, Trump, obviously is just sort of like a spitball machine of, random things. So some days Trump seems like the most liberal person you've ever met, and some days, the most alt-right person. But, he said maybe, Gazans will start to filter into other, Arab countries around it. Obviously, the history of Palestinians in places like Jordan are actually much worse than anything that Israel's ever, done to them. But, I thought that was quite interesting just in terms of solving this, Palestinian refugee crisis kind of once and for all.
I just had this pretend conversation this morning with my husband about what that conversation between Netanyahu and Trump would look like. So, I role played out loud both voices. And I think it seems preposterous. I don't see how it could possibly happen. And then I see Trump saying, "Oh, I'll make it happen," and Netanyahu saying, "Great, go do it." It's just, yes, people should be safe. People should have a right to their homeland. People should have freedom. This is an intractable problem because, as you say, people are not looking out for the Palestinian people's best interests. They're not looking for them to start lives and have healthy futures with their families. They're looking to use them as political pawns to destroy the state of Israel.
Amazing. Anything else?
I think we did it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. If people want to read your articles, where can they find it?
Well, I think the best way would probably just to be Google Julie Marzouk, but I have written a bunch in the Jerusalem Post, in Times of Israel, in the OC Register. You can also find them on Marzouk Evolve Advocacy Consulting, which is my webpage. And you can email me from there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Very good. Thanks, Daniel.